The bride stood perfectly still in the center of the grand wedding hall, her fingers tightly wrapped around the bouquet she could no longer feel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, the orchestra played a soft melody, and hundreds of smiling faces surrounded her, but none of those smiles were meant for her. Instead, they whispered, "She doesn't belong here. Did you see?" Her parents sighed. Half the seats were empty. She grew up with nothing. How is she supposed to fit into this family? Every sentence reached Emma's ears like the sting of cold rain. She kept her head high, refusing to let anyone see the tears forming in her eyes. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it felt like a public trial. Across the room stood her husband, Daniel. He had married her because he loved her kindness, her honesty, and the quiet strength she carried through years of hardship. Yet even he seemed overwhelmed by the constant pressure from his wealthy relatives. Every few minutes someone pulled him aside to complain. "You could have married anyone. You're throwing away your future. Our family deserves someone with status." Daniel defended Emma whenever he could, but the criticism never stopped. Emma remembered her tiny childhood home where the roof leaked every rainy season. Her father had worked long hours as a mechanic while her mother stretched every dollar into enough food for the family. Despite having little, their home had always been filled with warmth. Her mother believed that a house became a home only when everyone who entered felt welcome. She often said, "A rich table isn't measured by expensive food. It's measured by how many people leave it feeling loved." Those words stayed with Emma long after her mother passed away. She had learned to cook beside her mother before she was even tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. They baked bread together every Sunday. They stirred soup in old pots that had been repaired countless times. They laughed over burned cookies and celebrated every successful meal as if it belonged in a five-star restaurant. Those memories were worth more than any fortune. Back in the wedding hall, however, none of that seemed to matter. To Daniel's relatives, Emma was simply the poor girl. One elegant woman approached with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I suppose you've never attended a wedding like this before." Emma answered politely. "No. It must all seem overwhelming." "A little." The woman laughed softly before walking away to another group. Another guest examined Emma's wedding dress. "It's beautiful, surprisingly tasteful for someone on such a small budget." Several women chuckled. Emma simply smiled. She had promised herself one thing before walking into the ceremony. No matter how cruel people became, she would never answer cruelty with cruelty. Hours passed. Dinner was served. The tables overflowed with expensive dishes prepared by famous chefs. Every plate looked like a work of art. Yet despite all the luxury, something felt strangely empty. People barely spoke to one another unless it was about business, investments, or social status. Emma quietly noticed one of the serving staff accidentally drop a tray. A glass shattered. Several guests glared at the young waiter. "You should be fired. So careless." The young man's face turned pale. Before anyone else moved, Emma knelt beside him. "It's all right," she said gently. She helped him collect the broken pieces while asking if he had been injured. The waiter looked shocked. "No guest has ever helped me before." Emma smiled. "My mother always said everyone deserves kindness." Across the room, an elderly man watched the entire scene. His sharp eyes missed nothing. He wasn't impressed by expensive jewelry or polished speeches. He paid attention to character. This man was Arthur Bennett, Daniel's grandfather and the founder of the family's business empire. Although age had slowed his steps, his mind remained as sharp as ever. For decades he had built companies, negotiated impossible deals, and judged thousands of people. He believed one simple truth. Real character only appears when no one expects to be watched. While everyone else criticized Emma, Arthur quietly observed. He noticed how she thanked every server. He noticed how she comforted Daniel's nervous younger cousin before the ceremony. He noticed how she greeted elderly guests before introducing herself to important executives. Most importantly, he noticed that she never complained. Not once. As dessert was being served, another round of whispers spread through the ballroom. Someone deliberately asked loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I wonder whether she even knows how to manage a proper household." Another replied. "These days girls only know how to order food online." Laughter followed. Emma lowered her eyes. Daniel clenched his fists. Before he could respond, the sound of a cane striking the marble floor echoed through the hall. Tap, tap, tap. Every conversation stopped. Arthur Bennett slowly rose from his chair. Even the musicians fell silent. When the family patriarch stood, everyone listened. He walked toward Emma with calm determination. No anger appeared on his face. No smile either. Only quiet curiosity. He stopped directly in front of the bride. The entire ballroom watched. Some expected him to criticize her. Others assumed he would lecture her about carrying the Bennett family name. Instead, he asked only one question. Can you cook? The room became perfectly silent. Emma blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that. Neither had anyone else. For a brief moment she wondered if this was another trap. Another opportunity for someone to laugh at her. Then she looked into Arthur's eyes. There was no mockery. Only sincerity. She answered honestly. Yes. Arthur nodded once. What was the first meal your mother ever taught you to prepare? Emma smiled for the first time that evening. Her fear slowly disappeared. She wasn't remembering recipes. She was remembering home. My mother taught me vegetable soup, she said softly. Then homemade bread. And later, apple pie. Arthur listened without interrupting. Why those meals? He asked. Emma's voice became steadier. Because they were affordable. She paused before continuing. But mostly because they could feed anyone. If a neighbor lost their job. If someone became sick. If a stranger knocked on our door. There was always enough soup to share. Many guests shifted uncomfortably. Arthur asked one final question. And what did your mother teach you while you cooked? Emma looked around the magnificent ballroom. Then she answered from the heart. She said food isn't meant to impress people. It's meant to remind them they matter. Silence spread across every table. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others suddenly remembered the meals their own mothers once made. Arthur smiled. For the first time all evening, genuine warmth appeared on his weathered face. He turned toward the entire family. Tomorrow morning, he announced in a clear voice, this bride will prepare breakfast. Several relatives laughed openly. A billionaire family's breakfast. Is this some kind of joke? We have professional chefs. Arthur ignored every interruption. He looked back at Emma. Will you do it? Emma met his eyes without hesitation. Yes. I'd be honored. Arthur nodded. Good. Then he delivered the sentence that would change everything. Tomorrow morning, we will discover who truly understands the meaning of family. No one in the ballroom realized that breakfast would become far more than a meal. Before the sun set the next day, hidden secrets would surface, hardened hearts would begin to soften, and the woman everyone had mocked would earn the respect of the entire Bennett family. Not because of wealth, status, or perfection, but because she possessed something money could never buy. Emma barely slept that night. The Bennett mansion was enormous, filled with polished marble floors, priceless paintings, and hallways so quiet they almost echoed. It was a world completely different from the small house where she had grown up. Every room reminded her that she was now part of one of the wealthiest families in the city, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still an outsider. She woke before sunrise. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock. Instead of waiting for servants, Emma quietly tied her hair back, put on a simple apron, and walked toward the kitchen. The mansion's kitchen looked more like a restaurant than a family home. Stainless steel counters stretched across the room, expensive cookware hung neatly on the walls, and every ingredient imaginable was carefully organized. Several professional chefs were already there. When they saw Emma, they exchanged curious glances. One of them stepped forward politely. Mrs. Bennett, breakfast is our responsibility. Please don't worry. Emma smiled warmly. I know. But your grandfather invited me to cook today. I'd appreciate your help, not because I need it, but because I'd love for us to work together. The chefs looked at one another. No member of the Bennett family had ever spoken to them that way. Instead of giving orders, she asked for cooperation. The head chef nodded. What would you like to prepare? Emma looked over the fresh vegetables, flour, eggs, herbs, and fruit laid out before her. Then she smiled. Nothing extravagant. The chefs looked confused. No imported delicacies. No expensive seafood. Emma gently shook her head. I'd rather cook something that reminds people of home. She chose fresh eggs, potatoes, tomatoes, mushrooms, onions, herbs, warm bread dough, seasonal fruit, and ingredients for cinnamon rolls. She also prepared oatmeal with honey, homemade jam, fresh orange juice, and rich coffee. As she worked, she hummed a song her mother used to sing while cooking. Soon the kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and butter sizzling in a pan. One young kitchen assistant quietly whispered, "It smells different." The head chef smiled. "It smells like someone actually loves cooking." Emma heard him and laughed softly. "My mother used to say people can taste your mood in your food." Everyone in the kitchen smiled. For the first time in years, the staff weren't simply preparing another luxury meal. They were cooking together. As the sun rose, the long dining table was set. One by one, family members entered the room. Several looked surprised. Where are the usual breakfast platters? No caviar. No imported pastries. One woman frowned at the simple dishes. This looks ordinary. Arthur Bennett entered last. He slowly took his seat at the head of the table. Without saying a word, he picked up a slice of warm homemade bread, spread a little butter across it, and took one bite. His eyes closed for a moment. He wasn't tasting bread. He was tasting memories. "It tastes," he whispered, "like my mother's kitchen." The room became quiet. Emma looked down, unsure how to respond. Arthur smiled gently. "My mother baked bread every morning before my brothers and I went to school. We weren't wealthy then. We owned nothing except hope." No one had ever heard Arthur speak about his childhood. The grandchildren exchanged surprised glances. He continued, "When our family finally became successful, I promised myself my children would never know hunger." His voice softened. But somewhere along the way, they forgot what gratitude tasted like. Silence settled over the table. Everyone slowly began serving themselves. Daniel tasted the scrambled eggs. "They're perfect." His younger sister tried the cinnamon rolls. She laughed with delight. "These are amazing." Even the relatives who had mocked Emma the previous evening reluctantly filled their plates. Within minutes, conversations changed. Instead of discussing stock markets and luxury vacations, family members began sharing stories. "This reminds me of Grandma's soup. My father used to make potatoes like these. I haven't had homemade jam in years." The atmosphere grew warmer with every bite. Even the household staff noticed. People who normally rushed through breakfast stayed seated. They smiled. They laughed. They actually listened to one another. Arthur quietly observed everything. Then he stood. "I asked Emma one question yesterday." Everyone looked toward him. "I asked if she could cook." He paused. "Most of you assumed I wanted to know whether she could prepare food." He slowly shook his head. "I didn't." The room fell silent again. "I wanted to know whether she understood something many wealthy people eventually forget." He looked directly at his family. "Cooking has never been about recipes. It's about serving. It's about patience. It's about noticing when someone is hurting before they ask for help." He turned toward Emma. "This young woman reminded me of something I feared our family had lost." His voice became firm. "Humility." No one spoke. Arthur continued. "Last night many of you judged her because she came from a poor family. You measured her by her bank account. You measured her by her clothes. You measured her by things that disappear." He placed one hand gently on Emma's shoulder. "But character. That only grows stronger with time." Several relatives lowered their heads in embarrassment. The aunt who had mocked Emma's dress slowly stood. She walked around the table until she stood beside Emma. For several long seconds, she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry." The entire room froze. "I judged you before I knew you." Emma smiled kindly. "You don't owe me perfection." She extended her hand. "Only honesty." The older woman suddenly hugged her. One by one, other relatives followed. Some apologized for rude comments. Others admitted they had allowed pride to blind them. Even the youngest members of the family gathered around Emma, asking if she would teach them how to make the cinnamon rolls. She laughed. "Only if you're prepared to get flour all over yourselves." The children cheered. Arthur watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. Later that morning, after everyone had left the dining room, Daniel found his grandfather standing by the garden window. "I knew you had a reason for asking that question," Daniel said. Arthur smiled. "I wasn't testing Emma." Daniel looked puzzled. "You weren't." Arthur shook his head. "No. I was testing the rest of you." Daniel remained silent. Arthur looked toward the empty breakfast table. A family that cannot recognize kindness when it stands in front of them is already poor, no matter how much money they possess. Daniel's eyes filled with emotion. "You've always judged people differently." Arthur nodded. "Business taught me how to build wealth." He smiled toward the kitchen, where Emma could be heard laughing with the staff. But life taught me how to recognize treasure. That afternoon, the Bennett family gathered for one final photograph after the wedding celebrations. This time, no one whispered behind Emma's back. Instead, they asked her to stand beside Arthur in the center of the family. As the photographer prepared to take the picture, Arthur quietly leaned toward Emma. "You didn't just cook breakfast today." Emma looked at him curiously. "What did I do?" Arthur smiled. "You reminded this family that the richest home isn't the one with the biggest dining room." He looked around at the smiling faces that had seemed so cold only a day earlier. "It's the one where everyone feels welcome at the table." The camera flashed. It captured more than a family portrait. It captured the beginning of a new legacy, one built not on wealth, but on kindness, humility, and the simple power of a meal prepared with love. The breakfast became the talk of the Bennett family for weeks. Relatives who had once measured success by luxury brands and business deals now found themselves talking about warm bread, homemade jam, and the feeling of sitting together without pretending to be someone they were not. For Emma, however, life did not suddenly become perfect. Winning respect at one breakfast table was easier than changing years of pride and old habits. A few family members still questioned whether she truly belonged in the Bennett family. They were simply quieter about it now. Emma chose not to argue. She believed that time revealed a person's heart better than words ever could. Over the next several months, she quietly became part of the household. She learned the names of every gardener, driver, cleaner, and security guard. She remembered their birthdays, asked about their children, and thanked them at the end of each day. When one of the housekeepers lost her husband unexpectedly, Emma organized meals for the grieving family and visited them every evening after work. When the head gardener became ill, she spent an afternoon helping him plant flowers because she knew he worried about falling behind. None of these acts were done for attention. In fact, most of the Bennett family never knew. But Arthur noticed. He always noticed. One rainy afternoon, he invited Emma to join him in the mansion's old library. The room smelled of leather-bound books and polished wood. Large windows overlooked the gardens where raindrops gently tapped against the glass. Arthur handed Emma a small wooden box. "I've been waiting to give this to someone," he said. Emma opened it carefully. Inside was a faded recipe book, its pages worn from decades of use. The cover simply read, "Margaret Bennett's Kitchen. My mother's recipes," Arthur explained. Emma looked up in surprise. "I can't accept something so precious." Arthur smiled. "I disagree." She gently turned the pages. Each recipe had handwritten notes in the margins. Daniel loved extra cinnamon. Made this soup when money was tight. Always baked bread before welcoming guests. Some pages even had tiny stains left behind by flour and butter decades earlier. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful." Arthur nodded. "My mother believed recipes weren't meant to stay inside a family." He smiled softly. They were meant to spread kindness. Emma carefully closed the book. "I promise I'll treasure it." "I know you will." A few days later, Arthur called a family meeting. Everyone gathered in the mansion's sitting room, expecting another discussion about business investments. Instead, Arthur announced something completely unexpected. "I've decided to open the old Bennett community house again." Confused murmurs spread across the room. The building had once served free meals to struggling families decades earlier before eventually closing. One uncle frowned. "Grandfather, restoring that place will cost millions." Arthur simply nodded. "I'm aware." Another cousin asked. "But why now?" Arthur looked toward Emma. "Because someone reminded me why we built it in the first place." Every eye turned toward her. Emma looked uncomfortable with the attention. Arthur continued. "Our family became wealthy because people trusted us. We've spent years protecting our fortune. It's time we started sharing our blessings." Some relatives looked uncertain. Others quietly agreed. Then Arthur made another announcement. "I want Emma to lead the project." The room fell silent. Emma's eyes widened. "Me?" Arthur smiled. "You understand hospitality better than anyone here." Daniel squeezed her hand. "You can do this." Although nervous, Emma accepted. Over the following months, she worked tirelessly alongside volunteers, architects, chefs, and local charities. Instead of creating an elegant charity reserved for wealthy donors, Emma designed something simple. Every person who walked through the doors would receive a hot meal. No questions. No judgment. No paperwork. Families struggling to pay bills sat beside elderly neighbors living alone. Students ate next to construction workers. Business owners shared tables with homeless veterans. Everyone was treated with equal dignity. Emma often cooked alongside volunteers. She remembered names. She listened to stories. She celebrated birthdays. She comforted grieving parents. Soon, something remarkable happened. The community house became famous, not because of expensive decorations, but because people genuinely felt welcome. Local newspapers began writing articles about it. Television reporters visited. Donations poured in from businesses across the city. One reporter interviewed Arthur. "What inspired you to reopen this place?" Arthur smiled. A young woman answered one simple question. The reporter looked puzzled. "What question?" Arthur laughed. "I asked whether she could cook. And her answer reminded me what leadership really means." Months later, the Bennett Foundation held its annual charity gala. Unlike previous years, the event wasn't focused on raising the largest donation. Instead, guests heard stories from families whose lives had changed. A single mother described finding hope after losing her job. An elderly widower spoke about finally feeling less alone. A teenage student explained how free meals allowed him to finish school without worrying about hunger. Many guests wiped away tears. At the end of the evening, Arthur slowly walked onto the stage. The room immediately became quiet. "I've spent over 70 years building companies," he began. "I've signed contracts worth billions. I've won awards." He paused. "But none of those achievements compare to watching someone restore compassion to my family." He turned toward Emma, inviting her onto the stage. The audience applauded as she joined him. Arthur reached into his pocket and removed the same wooden spoon his mother had once used. The old spoon had been carefully polished but still showed years of wear. He handed it to Emma. "My mother always believed this spoon belonged to whoever understood its purpose." Emma looked at it in disbelief. "It isn't valuable because it's old. It's valuable because it has served others for generations." Arthur smiled warmly. "Now it's yours." The audience stood in a long, heartfelt ovation. Many people weren't applauding the spoon. They were applauding the message behind it. Emma held back tears as she looked across the room. She remembered the frightened bride who had stood alone in the wedding hall, listening to strangers whisper that she didn't belong. Now those same people looked at her with admiration instead of doubt. Later that evening, as the gala ended and guests slowly departed, Daniel and Emma walked through the gardens hand in hand. The night air was cool, and the stars shimmered above them. Daniel smiled. "Do you remember grandfather's question?" Emma laughed softly. "Can you cook?" It sounded so strange. She nodded. "I thought he was testing me." Daniel looked toward the brightly lit community house in the distance, where volunteers were still serving late dinners to families in need. "He wasn't testing your cooking." Emma smiled. "No. He was looking for someone who understood that the greatest meals aren't remembered because they were expensive." Daniel squeezed her hand. "They're remembered because they made people feel loved." Emma looked toward the lights shining from the community house windows. At that moment, she finally understood why her mother had insisted on teaching her simple recipes instead of complicated ones. Food could fill a stomach, but kindness could heal a heart. And sometimes, one honest answer to one unexpected question could change not only a family's future, but an entire community's. 5 years passed, but no one in the Bennett family ever forgot the morning that had changed everything. The old community house had grown into a thriving center of hope. What had begun as a simple kitchen serving warm meals had expanded into cooking classes, job training workshops, after-school programs for children, and support groups for families facing difficult times. People from every corner of the city came through its doors. Some arrived hungry. Some arrived lonely. Many left believing in themselves again. At the center of it all was Emma. She still wore simple clothes, greeted everyone by name, and spent more time in the kitchen than in her office. Volunteers often laughed that she refused to let anyone else make the bread because she insisted every loaf should remind people they were welcome. One crisp autumn morning, a young woman named Lily walked into the community house carrying her 6-year-old son by the hand. She looked exhausted. Her husband had passed away the previous year, bills had piled up, and she had recently lost her apartment. Embarrassed, she whispered to the receptionist, "I don't have any money." Before anyone else could answer, Emma overheard her. She walked over with the same gentle smile that had comforted so many people before. "You don't need money to come in here," Emma said softly. Lily looked confused. "But I can't pay." Emma knelt beside the little boy. Can you tell me your favorite food? The child smiled shyly. My grandma used to make tomato soup. Emma stood and looked toward the kitchen. Then tomato soup it is. As they ate together, Lily shared her story through tears. Emma listened without interrupting, just as her own mother had always listened to neighbors who needed comfort more than advice. By the end of the meal, Lily wasn't just leaving with a full stomach. She had been connected with housing assistants, a local employer looking for staff, and volunteers who would help enroll her son in school. Months later, Lily returned, not as someone asking for help, but as one of the center's most dedicated volunteers. She often told newcomers, "Someone fed me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." Watching moments like these became Arthur Bennett's greatest joy. Though his hair had turned completely white and his steps had grown slower, he still visited the community house every Friday. He never asked for special treatment. Instead, he sat quietly in the dining room, sipping tea and watching strangers become friends around shared tables. One afternoon, Arthur called Emma and Daniel to his home. When they arrived, they found him sitting in his favorite chair by the fireplace. The old recipe book rested on the table beside him. Arthur smiled as they entered. I have one last request. Daniel immediately became concerned. Grandfather, are you feeling all right? Arthur chuckled. I'm 92 years old. Feeling all right changes from day to day. The three of them laughed. Then Arthur's expression grew thoughtful. I spent most of my life believing my greatest achievement was building a business. He slowly shook his head. I was wrong. Emma quietly reached for his hand. My greatest achievement, Arthur continued, was recognizing the right person before everyone else did. Emma's eyes filled with tears. You gave me a chance. Arthur smiled. No, my dear. You earned it. A few weeks later, the Bennett family received the news they had feared. Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep. The city mourned one of its most respected businessmen, but those closest to him knew he wanted no grand display of wealth at his funeral. Instead of expensive floral arrangements, Arthur had left one unusual instruction in his will. Feed everyone who comes. On the day of the funeral, long tables were placed in the gardens outside the Bennett estate. Volunteers from the community house prepared fresh bread, homemade soup, roasted vegetables, pies, and warm tea using Arthur's mother's recipes. Business leaders sat beside construction workers. Politicians shared meals with schoolteachers. Former employees laughed with families who had once depended on the community house. No one cared about titles. Everyone simply ate together. After the meal, Daniel stepped forward to address the guests. My grandfather asked one question that changed all our lives. Many people smiled, already knowing the story. Daniel looked toward Emma before continuing. He asked my wife, can you cook? A gentle laugh spread through the crowd. At the time, everyone thought he was asking about food. Daniel's voice softened. But he was really asking something much deeper. Can you care for others? Can you serve without expecting praise? Can you make people feel at home? He turned toward Emma. She answered those questions long before she ever spoke. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Years continued to pass. The Bennett Community House eventually opened centers in several neighboring cities. Thousands of volunteers joined the mission, and millions of meals were served. Yet Emma never allowed success to change the heart of the organization. Every new volunteer heard the same lesson on their first day. Or not just serving food. Or serving dignity. One Saturday afternoon, while teaching a children's cooking class, Emma noticed a little girl standing quietly in the corner. The child looked nervous. Emma walked over. Would you like to help me bake bread? The girl hesitated. I'm not very good at cooking. Emma smiled. Neither was I when I started. The little girl slowly joined her. As they kneaded the dough together, the child asked, how did you learn? Emma paused for a moment. Then she smiled at the memory. My mother taught me. What did she teach you first? Emma looked around the bright kitchen filled with children laughing, flour covering the tables, and volunteers smiling as they worked together. She remembered the wedding hall. The whispers. The tears. The unexpected question that had changed her life. Finally, she answered. She taught me that the most important ingredient isn't flour or butter. The children listened carefully. It's kindness. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Emma locked the kitchen and stood alone for a moment. On the highest shelf rested two treasured possessions: Margaret Bennett's handwritten recipe book and the old wooden spoon Arthur had entrusted to her. She gently picked up the spoon and smiled. So much changed because of one simple question, she whispered. Outside, families left the community house carrying leftovers, laughing together as children raced toward waiting cars. The lights inside the building glowed warmly against the evening sky, just like the little kitchen where Emma had first learned to cook beside her mother many years before. She realized that life had come full circle. The frightened bride who had once been judged for her poverty had become the woman who made thousands of strangers feel rich in hope. And in the end, Arthur's question had never been about cooking at all. It was about the kind of heart a person carried. Because recipes can be learned. Wealth can be earned. Success can be built. But a heart that welcomes others with compassion is the rarest gift of all, and when shared, it has the power to change families, communities, and generations forever.